Please join me now in welcoming Peter Chilson.
Thank you. I want to thank Richard and Cornell for making these talks happen. It's a great opportunity for us in the faculty to come and share our work, and I think these talks that the Foley Center sponsors are a huge resource for the whole campus. It's really a wonderful thing. Can you all hear me? Well, I'll speak up some more. So, before I begin, I need to clarify a few things. I've never met Amadou Koufa, the Quranic scholar and preacher turned jihadist that I'm going to talk about today. What I know of him, I gathered through reporting visits to Mali in 2011, 2012, and 2014, and from document research. Second, the Amadou Kufa story is connected to the tensions driving hundreds of thousands of people, mostly young men and women, to travel across the Sahara every year north to North Africa, where they bet the rest of what they have on crossing the Mediterranean Sea in all manner of rickety craft to reach Europe. Thousands have died in the desert and water crossings, and they continue to die today. And that's there's a real connection between what's going on in this story and the refugee and immigration story that is really involving the entire globe right now. Thirdly, this talk is drawn from an essay I published this summer in Consequence, a magazine that focuses on the culture of war and that is affiliated with the Joyner Institute for the Study of the Social Consequences of War at the University of Massachusetts. The essay is called The Holy War of Amadou Koufa. This also happens to be the title of a talk I gave here 4 years ago, in which I said erroneously, and which I guess now is immortalized in this video, in which I said erroneously that Amadou Koufa had been killed in a French air raid in the central Malian town of Kona in January 2013. My reporting, in my own defense, was based on French and Malian military claims that Koufa died in a strafing attack by French Mirage fighter jets on jihadist forces in the town of Kona. I'd also gathered eyewitness accounts in Kona. People told me of seeing Koufa's bloody body loaded into a pickup truck. That much is probably true, but he wasn't dead. I withdrew my article from publication until I could figure out a way to tell the Koufa story properly, and what I'm going to talk about today is part of what I came up with. So I'm going to talk about the role Amadou Koufa plays in what is happening in Mali today. Then I'll finish with an account of what it was like to be on the ground in Mali, trying to get close to the life and character of Amadou Koufa at a time when I thought he was dead. So this is a map of Mali. I'm just going to refer to it quickly. There's the context of Mali in West Africa, and the region I'm going to be referring to through most of the talk is the Mopti region, right here in the center of the country. This is the contested northern zone, and just for your information, that's Timbuktu there, famous illustrious cultural center in Mali. Since 2013, Koufa's success as a jihadist warlord underscores the failure of the Malian army, 5,000 French troops and 14,000 United Nations peacekeepers to stabilize not only Mali, but the west of the West African Sahel region. That's the largest UN peacekeeping force on the ground in the world. More than 3,000 civilians have died in Mali alone, and thousands more in neighboring countries, in what has become a slow-burning regional civil war that has displaced 1 million people. The jihadist effort that has engulfed Mauritania, Burkina Faso, and Niger is centered in Mali, where hundreds of government soldiers have been killed in the last 6 years, 100 just in the past 2 months. Nearly 300 UN peacekeepers have died, making Mali also the world's most dangerous United Nations peacekeeping assignment. On November 2nd, just a few days ago, 54 Malian soldiers died in one attack near the border with Niger. 24 more soldiers died 2 days ago in another attack near Burkina Faso. And just this past week, Mali decided to pull its forces from rural areas across the north and the central part of the country to concentrate them in urban zones. The governments of neighboring countries are also having trouble holding on to their rural areas, where government increasingly means little. So what this means is there are no schools open, there are no health services, no post offices, no infrastructure support across these areas. It appears as if we are witnessing right now the slow collapse of the entire Sahel region of West Africa. And that's this region right here, in which there is possibly a gradual breakdown of the colonial borders that were drawn about 125 years ago by countries, mainly France and Britain, in this zone. Part of this has to do with the success of Amadou Koufa and other Muslim preachers in appealing to rural populations for a return to a lifestyle of strict adherence to Quranic law. And I want to bring up Koufa's picture here. I have 3 of them. So this is the first known picture of him. And when I was operating in Niger in 2011, 2012, and in 2014, it was the only photograph known of him. These are photographs that have emerged later, and I'll talk about them in a little bit. But here he's a much younger man, and here you can see these are photographs that are just a couple of years old. These other 2 photographs. So it's part of what's going on has to do with the success of preachers like Amadou Kufa in appealing to rural populations for a return to a lifestyle of strict adherence to Quranic law. They have accused the government of Mali and other governments in the region of, among other things, they've criticized them for strict adherence I'm a bit lost here, of among other things of being anti-Islamic. For their embrace of Western education values in the school systems, which is one reason why it's so important to them to shut down the school systems in the rural areas. This includes the education of women and young girls in these schools, and they've also criticized them for teaching any language other than Arabic in these schools. So shutting down the school system in rural areas and eventually in the cities also is very important to the conservative Islamist movement that Kufa represents. This process began 30 years ago when preachers like Amadou Kufa launched mobile clandestine radio stations using an antenna and a basic crude radio transistor broadcast system hooked up to a car battery, so they could keep themselves mobile and away from the reach of the government. Crude but devastatingly effective over time. It's also important to understand that Kufa is a member of the Fulani tribe. They are traditional herders and among the first people to be converted to Islam by Arab merchants who brought the faith south across the desert by camel caravan 1,000 years ago. But drought, which is the insidious byproduct of climate change, increasingly consumes the grasslands of the Sahel, and the Fulani today have found themselves in increasingly violent and destructive conflict with herders and farmers of other tribes. And that conflict also accounts for the high casualties among civilians in the last 6 years. In Mali alone, it's between 3,000 and 4,000 dead, just among civilians. Amadou Koufa, born into a family of herders in the region of Timbuktu 58 years ago, we're the same age, Koufa and I, has positioned himself as a Fulani savior, boasting in his radio broadcasts of his plan to revive the 19th century Fulani Empire of Messina, which conquered much of inland West Africa in the 1820s with the aim of establishing an Islamic caliphate. The empire rose from the Mufti countryside of what is now central Mali to rule a swath of West Africa roughly the size of the state of Idaho. And they did that for about 60 years. But after the deaths of the movement's leaders, which caused quite a bit of infighting, the movement began to collapse. And in that weakened state, the French army delivered the decisive blow that destroyed the empire in 1893. And that also coincides with the date during which, roughly that period of time during which France succeeded in pacifying West Africa and North Africa into a gigantic 1.8 million square mile colonial zone that France ran until about 1958, 59, 60, when successive countries became independent. And we can talk about this later in questions if you want, but those borders that France drew are really starting, in my opinion, to crumble only now. And that's partly as a result of this rebellion that men like Amadou Koufa have launched. Koufa's promise of the return of the empire and revenge against the French has made it impossible for the Malian army, the French, and the United Nations to successfully operate across a region where the local population either does not support them or is too frightened to show support. This situation helped cause the deaths of 4 American Green Berets in the Tillabéri region of western Niger near the Malian border in 2017 when they were attacked by forces linked to the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. And maybe some of you remember that story of the death of those Green Berets. You can actually see it on YouTube. The whole thing filmed by themselves. The Islamic State fighters captured the video and then put it up on YouTube. You can still see that today. It's quite jarring to watch. For the record, Amadou Koufa is today a kind of jihadist free agent, loosely connected to Al-Qaeda, but also to the Islamic State. So he's playing both sides. And Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State actually don't get along. They're rival groups that are roughly fighting for the same thing. In this talk, I'm also tossing around the word jihad quite a bit, so I want to unpack that for a moment. Jihad is an Arabic term that means strive or struggle, and which Western media equates to holy war. And jihad actually doesn't mean holy war. That's sort of a media creation, that term. Though I do, in trying to market my own work, my essay in consequence is called The Holy War of Amadou Koufa, and his war is a holy war. But in that essay, I also investigate further the whole notion of what jihad actually is. The Quran refers to jihad in vague terms of struggle over one's relationship to Allah. Sunni Muslim extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State speak of jihad as the struggle by any means to return Islam to the ideals of the Prophet Muhammad and his closest advisors, known in Arabic as the Salaf, or in English translation as the predecessors. This is Amadou Koufa's ambition, to roll Islam back to the 7th century, down to how Muhammad wore his beard and the length of his pants. Kufa is 58 years old, his beard is gray, here he's dyed it red. Muhammad reportedly had, the Prophet Muhammad reportedly had red hair, and it's very popular among the jihadists to dye their hair red in order to try and get closer not only to the Prophet, but getting close to the Prophet is a way of getting close to God. So that's what informs that particular hairstyle there. Okay. After Kufa's reported death in the Battle of Kona in 2013, when the French intervened in Mali to stop a jihadist invasion of the south, rumors reported him buried in an unmarked grave in the desert near the city of Timbuktu. Other rumors had him in Pakistan for medical treatment, or he was recovering in refugee camps in Burkina Faso. It's never been clearly established. Kufa finally surfaced, undeniably alive, in a 2017 video with other jihadist leaders announcing a new alliance of Islamist groups called, forgive my Arabic pronunciation here, that alliance is called Jama'at Nasr al-Islam wal-Muslimin. This new group, which translates from the Arabic as Group for the Support of Islam and Muslims, includes Kufa's own organization, the Messina Liberation Front, Al-Qaeda, and others. The overall head of that group was killed by French troops 2 weeks ago. And so far, that claim is holding. Okay, that's an issue because after Kufa popped up alive in that 2017 video, a year after that, on November 22nd, 2018, France announced its troops had finally killed Kufa, along with dozens of his fighters in the Ouagadougou forest of western Mali, near the border with Mauritania. That announcement came with great fanfare, including photos of bodies lying on the ground in the aftermath of the battle. Al-Qaeda issued an immediate denial of Kufa's killing. But France ignored it and scoffed at that denial, because the denial didn't come with any proof until 2 months later. Another video comes up with a timestamp on it, and France did authenticate that video, and it was forced once again to withdraw its claim of having killed Amadou Kufa. And this is a screenshot of that video in which Kufa, very much uninjured, is giving an interview to journalists who represent an Islamist website under Al-Qaeda control. Today, Kufa and his men, many of them recruited when they were just boys, haunt central Mali, sowing landmines, raiding villages and hotels, killing soldiers, mayors, shopkeepers, and dissident imams who are the prayer leaders of the mosques. Any local leader who dissents is marked for death. Some are beaten to death before their families. Captured fighters of Kufa's rebel group carry his sermons on their cell phones. So what I'd like to do now is switch track a little bit to my experience on the ground in Mali, trying to figure out what kind of man Kufa was like. And during this section of what I'm talking about, I actually, during this time, was under the impression that Kufa was dead, and that really unnerves me. And that's part of what my new essay is about, is the way, is what it's like to be on the ground reporting this stuff, to also give you a sense of the incredible risks that war correspondents take. I'm not really one of them. I'm not that good. Okay. But I did spend this time on the ground, and I paid a little bit of a price for it. It's very, very difficult reporting to do. So I came across Kufa's name in April of 2012 for the first time, when I was traveling in central Mali in the first weeks of the Civil War on assignment for Foreign Policy magazine. At that time, there was only one known photo of Kufa. That's the photo on the far left. In 2012, the Malian army had just surrendered the entire north of the country, an area roughly the size of France and including the city and region of Timbuktu. And they had surrendered it to this rough alliance of jihadist groups, including Al-Qaeda and Tuareg nationalist groups seeking to set up their own country in the Sahara. So it was a fairly motley alliance, but they managed to kick the Malian army out, partly because they were much better armed with arms they had seized from stores of the former Libyan army in the wake of the collapse of Libya after the death of Muammar Gaddafi in October of 2011. So from October of 2011, when Libya collapsed, releasing this flood of arms across the whole region, to the early days of 2012 when northern Mali collapsed, that happened with there's a direct relationship between the release of those arms across the region and the inability of the Malian army to combat that. They were just overwhelmed. And in the Malian army's retreat from the north, they lost 80% of their ammunition and heavy military equipment. 80% of it was also seized by the jihadists. The jihadist advance still, they managed to stop it in the center of the country in Mufti region, which I'll just go back to a little bit here. Right in here, the jihadists advanced and they stopped there for a year. There was a military stalemate for about a year, and it was into that stalemate that I stepped as a journalist. I was one of the only people traveling around in this area between the newly occupied jihadist north and the government south. I had the whole story to myself. And I traveled with this man, whose name I've withdrawn from the article in order to protect him. His name in the article, I call him Yusuf. He's an old friend of mine, and I've used him as a fixer and translator for many years. We've been friends for almost 20 years now. This is the Land Rover we traveled in. And this is the man who, in many ways, kind of saved my life. So the Malian army in full flight, as I said, abandoned a great deal of its equipment, but it still managed to stop the jihadist advance in the center of the country. And that was about the time I arrived, and I began by myself and sometimes with my friend Yusuf, visiting a whole lot of villages in the center of the country, and that's where I first heard Kufa's name. A farmer translated for me a line from a cassette tape copy of one of Kufa's clandestine radio broadcasts, and I have this quote from that translation. Kufa said in that sermon, "I am chosen by God, death to those who do not hear me." And that kind of rhetoric really, really began to instill fear in the population, especially during the war. And Kufa's radio broadcasts really were picking up at this time. And everybody was listening to them. In the city of Bandiagara, I have a street scene here from Bandiagara. This is a typical street in that city. It's a city of 17,000. And it's one of central Mali's largest towns. It's gateway to the famed Dogon Highlands. Has anyone ever visited the Dogon country from this? You have. So you know what I'm talking about. Anyone else? It's a remarkable place. It was once very popular with tourists and with rock climbers. And in the city in April of 2012, I encountered outright panic, part of which was fed by a series of propaganda broadcasts in which Amadou Koufa was warning the population to prepare for Islamist rule. Bandiagara was also one of the places where the Malian army was regrouping after withdrawing from the north. Soldiers were sandbagging street corners and rooftops, setting up machine gun and mortar posts. I went to visit people I knew at a small agricultural aid agency, only to find out that they'd already fled to the south. The remaining staffers were rushing in and out of the building, a small concrete villa with red-tiled roofing, and they were carrying belongings and bundles of files and dumping it all on a big bonfire in the middle of the street, which was unpaved and deeply rutted. People carried out cardboard boxes stuffed with paper, brand new school books, grant proposals, budget reports, and they piled all of it onto the flames, which alternately burned white smoke or black depending on what they were throwing on the fire. One man tossed out a box of paperback Dick Francis novels translated into French. Any Dick Francis fans here? Cool, Alex, all right. They turned CDs and DVD, they burned CDs and DVDs as well, photographs, cassette tapes, magazines, maps, all the music and movies and images that they thought would get them a flogging or worse at the hands of Islamic policemen. Flames jumped and bobbed as if eager to tell what was in all that stuff, spewing sparks and ash in a cloud that rushed away in a hard west wind. Scenes like this were unfolding all over the city of Bandiagara. Bonfires burned on every street. Ash and stray bits of paper blew about as the wind gusted. I saw a young woman run out of the aid agency, clutching a red shopping bag in her hands. She was barefoot and wore a traditional African flowered print dress that fell to her ankles and a headscarf. When she threw her bag on the flames, 3 pairs of high-heeled shoes, red and white and black, spilled out and caught fire immediately, bleeding black smoke. She looked into the fire a few seconds and then jogged back inside. In the wind, her scarf flapped from a knot at her neck. I'd never seen this sort of thing before. People parting with their belongings in random panic. I thought of a famous Vietnam War photograph, and maybe some of you have seen this photograph, of an American helicopter on a rooftop in Saigon, evacuating people up a stairway. It turned out to be CIA staffers as the city fell to the North Vietnamese in the early 1970s. So Kufa became kind of an obsession for me. I left Mali and wrote an ebook about the war, but I always had this man in the back of my mind, and he wasn't yet really a household word. He was known to journalists, and people in rural areas certainly knew of him. They'd all heard his radio broadcasts. But he wasn't the household word that he is now across West Africa, where he's regarded as one of the principal and most dangerous jihadist warlords in the whole broad regional civil war. His reputation was that of a preacher who had recruited hundreds of teenage boys between the ages of 8 and 16 from across central Mali to join his jihad. I wanted to know how he'd done that recruiting and how he planned to revive an old empire, the Empire of Messina, which got going in the 1820s and collapsed, as I said, in 1893. So in the summer of 2014, I went back. I went back when I thought that Kufa was dead and my research would be relatively safe. The war was ongoing, but it was also in a kind of lull. I traveled with my friend Yusuf, and I'll just remind you that he was born and raised in Bandiagara. He's a member of the Dogon tribe, and that tribe is in full-on conflict with the Fulani tribe at this point, the Dogon being mainly sedentary farmers and the Fulani being nomadic herders. Those animals that belong to the nomadic herders often travel across farmland, and that puts the two ethnic groups in direct conflict. That conflict has produced a lot of violence and a lot of dead. And Kufa has presented himself as a kind of Fulani savior, a representative and a leader of Fulani interests. So traveling in an old Land Rover, we visited villages where Kufa had first worked decades ago as a young Muslim preacher and teacher. He'd set up a string of Quranic schools known as madrasas, where children learn the Quran in Arabic. Yusuf and I discovered a pattern in those villages where Kufa stayed. He'd show up, throw himself on the grace of his hosts, then overwhelm them with his knowledge of Islam. He accused dissenters of blasphemy. Some village imams fled. In one village called Sarakoro Dogan, he insisted on exclusive access to a well near the house where he lived. His boys taunted anyone who approached the well. Many of these boys became soldiers in Kufa's Messina Liberation Front. Late in 2014, after I'd left Mali, Kufa's followers claimed the shooting death of an imam who resisted him, and the imams, again, are the leaders of the prayer in the mosques. And in the years since, many hundreds of civilians have died in violence between Fulani herders and farmers, much of it fueled by Kufa and his soldiers. Kufa's boys, in other words, have grown up. During our travels, Yusuf and I spent many days in the remote bush and sleeping in villages. Yusuf kept telling me, this man is a really bad spirit. One villager told us that he'd refused Kufa's request to marry his 13-year-old daughter. And Kufa said to him, well, the villager told us that Kufa said to him that he condemned me to hell. Kufa married the girl. Gradually, Kufa's character became clearer to me as someone we all know. The predator who uses flattery, then threats, maybe a colleague, a relative, a neighbor. I think we've all met people like this. Yusuf and I learned that in 1999, Kufa showed up penniless in Sarakoro Dogan, which is a few miles from the city of Bandiagara. A village elder gave him a bed and food. Kufa repaid him by spreading rumors that he insulted the Quran. The old man banished Kufa from his home, but Kufa bullied villagers into giving him land for a madrasa and house, one of several homes he kept around the region. Villagers caved in, afraid of being labeled bad Muslims. We found his house in Sarakoro Dogan, a 2-story mud building in a courtyard beside a goat pen strewn with old hay and scat. Kufa's boys had slept there. Some were preteen and others in their mid-teens. Innocents to begin with, but after weeks under Kufa's tutelage, they became enforcers, manipulated by promises of food and shelter and the threat of God's wrath. Around the region, Kufa built his following by going to people's homes to recruit their youngest sons for his madrasa. Some boys were surrendered to Kufa's care by parents who were too poor to raise them. The boys were not soldiers or jihadists, they were just kids, which made them more vulnerable to someone like Kufa and more dangerous. By day, the boys patrolled the village and others nearby, demanding food and money and threatening villagers Kufa disliked. He left for weeks at a time, returning to Sarakoro Dogan with more boys for his madrasa. The man who gave Kufa shelter would not meet me, but his eldest son, a high school student, was eager to talk. Kufa, he said, was the wealthiest man in our village. He told Yusuf and me that in December 2011, weeks before the civil war began, Kufa left the village for good. He left like he came, the boy said. He appeared and disappeared. Well, what happened is that Kufa did resurface a few weeks later in early 2012 in the city of Timbuktu just after it had fallen to jihadist forces. He had with him dozens of boys recruited in villages like Sarakoro Dugan. The boys were sent for military training in Al-Qaeda camps. Most were never seen again. They were just one group of many hundreds he recruited over the years. One day, in July 2014, about a week before I left Mali, Yusuf and I visited a remote outdoor village market, a maze of wooden stalls set up in an open field. We found an electronics dealer who had cassette copies of Amadou Kufa's sermons he could duplicate for a fee. Stacks of Chinese batteries, transistor radios, and Arabic music CDs crowded his stall beside traders who sold cloth, raw jerky, raw salt, hardback Qurans beside prayer booklets and baskets of dates. Spices and sweat stung my eyes. The dealer made a copy on an old boombox as Kufa's sermon played out loud. Yusuf translated Fulani to French for me while we waited, listening to Kufa's steady nasal voice. Quote, "We must bring back the rule of God. Follow Allah and you will find paradise," end of quote. So I was not surprised to see young men gathering to hear Kufa, nodding their heads in agreement with what they were hearing. Some men studied me. Quote, "To protect Allah in our hearts, we must respect the sacred Quran," end of quote. And this just keeps playing on in the background. I was likely just imagining things, but at the time, I saw accusation in the eyes of the young men standing around Yusuf and me, and I worried that the ring of Kufa's voice might bring on an ugly scene. When the recording finished, I paid for the cassette, and Yusuf and I hurried away. So, I want to leave you with one more thing. The more I learned about Amadou Kufa, the more I believed he wore Islam like a disguise, that he was more interested in power and fame than in really spreading the word of God. In other words, I didn't think he was a very good Muslim. His spirit, however, did creep under my skin. A couple of weeks into our journey across central Mali, I developed hives on my chest and hands and neck. At night, Yusuf packed my hands in cool mud and put a wet cloth on my neck. Mornings, I sat on my sleeping bag beneath a mosquito net, pulling myself together to face another day. Some of my fears were rational. I worried about kidnapping. For 20 years, Al-Qaeda affiliates in Mali and across the Sahel have been paying villagers and gangs to spot kidnapping targets. They already held many foreigners across North Africa, and my mind was full of those details. In November 2011, for example, weeks before the start of the Civil War, 2 French geologists were kidnapped in a town not far from where Yusuf and I were traveling. A few days after that, a German tourist was shot to death in Timbuktu and 3 of his friends seized. So during my travels, my rational fear turned darker. I suspected every person with a cell phone of reporting my location to Kufa's people. And in Africa, everybody's got a cell phone, just like here. I convinced myself that Yusuf, my good friend, was plotting to give me up for money. When he wasn't looking, I read his phone texts. One night, I dreamt I came upon him reciting Quranic verses like a madrasa student. And this is painful to admit about a man I'd known for 12 years at that time and who had been nothing but generous and honest with me. Yusuf opened up his home, he fed me, he risked his life to help me do my work. And in an earlier situation while we were reporting together, we were in a village that that was close to coming under attack by jihadist forces, or at least we thought. And he had hid me in his family home, and then spirited me out of town early in the morning in that same Land Rover. All at great risk to himself, because I'm the only white guy in the area, so it was well known what family I was staying with. And so he was putting himself and his family at great risk. So I've tried to rationalize my behavior as a side effect of malaria pills, which amplified my dreams in disturbing ways, but it's hard not to see how paranoia can lead to destructive misunderstandings and stereotyping, even of people you trust and love. I've never spoken to Yusuf of those things. Thanks, that's all I have. I will just show you a couple more pictures here. This is the region around the city of Bandiagara, very close to the Mali, Burkina Faso borderland, where a lot of fighting is going on. And this is what it looks like. This is part of this is just coming out of the Dogon Highlands, and you have this rocky, somewhat mountainous countryside. I guess that's all I have. Thank you very much. So if you have any questions, maybe I can take a few of those. We have, I guess, 11 to 12 minutes. Yes?
How much is the French involved in I know that they're big in there, but have they ever tried, like, how aggressive are they? Or are they, like, part of the UN forces?
So you're asking how aggressive are the French forces in the region?
Yeah, because I remember it was like 2 years ago that I remember reading about how we're really bombing and getting involved in that region.
So they do have on the ground about 5,000 troops, many of them highly trained French Foreign Legion troops. And they have a very developed drone system, as does the United States. We have a drone base in Niamey, the capital of Niger, and another one in Agadez, way out in the Sahara Desert in northeastern Niger. So they have put a great deal of resource on the ground, and they're losing. It's very, very hard. I'm not a military tactician, but it's very, very hard for any great military power to win a guerrilla war on the ground. We learned that in Vietnam. So and maybe I'm not answering your entire question.
Oh, no. You answered my question well enough. I guess my last question, and if you don't mind answering another one.
Go ahead.
So the Dogon Highlands, it's really rocky. Are we talking really high mountains, or is it just sort of like what I saw? It looked like clumps of rocks basically everywhere.
Right, and there's a sort of cliff country. It's about 3,000 feet, about 3,200 feet off the desert floor, and so it does get up fairly high. And actually, it's popular partly because during the hot months, it's so much cooler up there. And during the cold months from November to March, it's even cooler. So it's a comfortable place to visit, and it's a very popular place with the international rock climbing community. Not anymore. It's a war zone now. So the French are fighting this. If you want to Google Operation Barkhane, Barkhane, that's the name of their operation. They have 5,000 troops spread across the Sahel, about 3,000 of them in Mali alone. Another question over here.
Yeah, I had a question. What role, if any, do you think that the ICC plays in this? Do you see them as being effective? I know that they have a case that's open on Mali right now, but I think it's sort of stalled.
Right, so the International Criminal Court, they've had a couple of cases. One, the most recent one involves a jihadist captured from Timbuktu. There have been two, actually. The current case involved, I've forgotten that he had a nickname, Jihadi something or other. He was an Islamist judge. and who operated out of Timbuktu during the one-year period of its occupation in 2012. And he was known for condemning young men and women who were just seen together but not married, because anyone who was affiliated with any kind of music or any violation of Quranic law, he was the judge of past sentence, which involved stoning, execution. One of the favorite forms of stoning is to bury somebody in the ground up to the neck and then stone them to death. And he's now in The Hague in prison, facing a trial. And I'm not really sure at what stage that trial is. And the other one involved a member of the jihadist forces who was very involved in the destruction of Muslim mausoleums. Which represented a different branch of Islam that conflicted with the Islamist beliefs of the jihadists. So there are those two cases. And the current case involved that judge. And that hasn't been settled. The other guy, I believe, was convicted. So what that means, those cases are nice. They don't really mean a lot. That's not going to change what's happening on the ground in the war. In fact, they're meaningless. So, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Peter,
Yes.
we talked a little bit earlier, you and I, about the landlocked countries of Africa. We talked about Central African Republic. We talked about
Right.
also Burkina Faso, as well as Mali. What's the sort of, thanks for bringing up the map. What's the sort of role you think of being landlocked and poor but having resources, and then there's jihadists all over the place? How are those forces all playing together, do you think?
I think it does contribute to certainly the poverty of a country like Mali. Mali, traditionally in its pre-colonial history, actually stretched all the way to the Atlantic coast. And so it had that economic, political access to the coast. And the French artificially cut Mali and several other countries off by drawing these borders, leaving them sort of marooned in this area, in a situation in which they could not economically fend for themselves. An example of this is Mali's real farmland, the farmland that helps it support itself, is in the south here, right in the Niger River basin. The Niger River flows from Guinea all the way up through Bamako, the capital city, which is about there, all the way up through Mopti region, and then at Timbuktu it takes a hard eastward turn and flows on down through Niger and Mali, Nigeria. But Mali, as an independent country, has never been able to broadcast government power across the north. It never had the resources. It never had the money. It was never able to actually establish Mali as a government entity up in the north, and that's part of what the jihadist forces really took advantage of that. And it's always, ever since its independence, it's been a sort of client of the former colonial power. Today, Mali has two real great economic sources that help provide hard currency for its economy: gold, which has been a real resource ever since the old days of the Malian Empire, which began 1,000 years ago, and cotton. Both those resources are controlled by France. France really has a lock on that. In Niger, it's uranium and also cotton. So that relationship to France is there are lots of rumors regarding that relationship also. but it's really, I'm not sure how much France has really helped. France did intervene in 2013. It really set up this operation, and part of that was to try and stabilize the region so that it wouldn't be a launching point for attacks across the Sahara and across the Mediterranean Sea into Europe itself. Well, that failed big time. We if you've been paying attention to the news, the attacks in Paris, Italy, Spain, that really has not succeeded. What it's also produced is this huge outward flow of refugees. And now we have these large camps in Italy, Spain, and southern France, and that's producing a lot of domestic conflict within those countries themselves. Other questions? Did I answer your question?
You did, and actually, I'm sorry for a follow-up. Sorry.
Go ahead.
You mentioned about the refugees, and I think I read somewhere that Mali has around 500,000 internally displaced persons. It's probably more, actually.
Probably
I
more.
wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how that particular element is contributing to the instability in Mali.
Mali has about 200,000 people or more outside the country in camps in Burkina Faso. I visited a lot of them in Mauritania and Niger. And then it has a whole another group, hundreds of thousands of displaced people in the south. Okay. Meanwhile, tens of thousands, no one's quite sure of the actual number for Malians, have fled the country, have fled the continent altogether to Europe. So there's this, the resource of its own people has really destabilized the country. And when you have hundreds of thousands of people destabilized within the country like that, the government really does not have the resources to support them. And it's very, very reliant on the United Nations to do that. And that raises lots of questions about the independent entity of the Malian government to take care of its own people. That, and then there's an old story which has to do with climate change and the creeping Sahara Desert, which is a very real thing. The Sahara Desert is gradually moving south, and that for decades and decades and decades has been pushing populations south. That fact has sent millions of people from the Sahel region into the countries on the south, looking for work and looking for ways to support their impoverished villages in the Sahel, up in this part of Chad, Niger, Mali, Mauritania. So you have millions of people in these southern countries working as migrant workers, and that produced the instability that led directly to the civil war in Ivory Coast. It contributed to the civil war in Liberia. It also contributed to the civil war in Sierra Leone. Three of the bloodiest, most horrible conflicts to rise in West Africa in the last 30 years. They've all been settled, but in Ivory Coast in particular, that migrant population, which is now very, very old. The president of Ivory Coast, Ousmane Ouattara, is himself of Burkinabe ethnicity, and his standing for president of Ivory Coast was hugely controversial and partly contributed to the civil war. But he's managed to remain as president now for ever since the war ended in 2011. So that's another equation there, and that's been a hugely destabilizing effect on the region, and that has to do with the vast environmental difficulties of that area. Drought has become more and more destructive. And that explains also the conflict between nomadic herders and farmers, which isn't just in Mali, it's across the whole region. Yes?
This is more related to the climate change question. Since nomadic herders are moving their cattle up and down, they tend to trample the grass and potentially help extend the growth of the Sahara. Has there ever been like an attempt to try and convince them not to try and do that?
Well, there are
I know
lots
this
of
goes
aid
into-
programs in the field in which USAID, various different aid agencies have tried to work with both sides to on conflict resolution. Before the war, conflict resolution programs on the ground, that was one of the main best funded focuses of the work of organizations like the U.S. Agency for International Development, CARE International. Mercy Corps had a big program on the ground in which they were trying to bring the two sides together. I have a good friend now working in Timbuktu. He's Malian. His name is El Haji Jite. You can find him on Facebook, and he's got a great organization in which he's trying desperately, as a Malian citizen, he's only about 31 years old, he's trying desperately to bring the two sides together. And his ethnicity is representative of both sides. His family is intermarried between farmers and herders. He is Fulani, and he's also a member of the Bambara ethnic group. And you can find him El Haji Jite. You can find him on Facebook. Friend him, he'd love it. Okay, he's looking for as many followers as he can to try and spread the word. Yes.
I'm sorry for taking up it's time, but how many ethnic groups are spread across the different border regions?
I don't know for sure. Dozens and dozens and dozens. In Mali alone, I think there's officially 66.
Yeah, and they're like, some of them are pretty much divided right between those border lines. Like some
Yes.
of them are in Mauritania, etc.
Yes.
Unfortunately, we're out of time now.
Okay.
Please all join me in thanking Peter Chilson for a really interesting speech.